we focus too much on the substance, i.e. alcohol, and not enough on what it actually does for us. When it becomes your go-to coping mechanism, for me, that is when it becomes particularly harmful. You're asking someone to stop something that's been helping them for maybe weeks, months, maybe years, actually, with very little support in between. Substance use services and mental health services should be intertwined, and that, I would bring in then housing services, etc. My service, the service I would like to see is, if you relapse, the service would ask, what did we do that caused that relapse, or what didn't we do that caused that relapse?
Hello and welcome everyone to one of Alcohol Review's occasional short video news interviews. You'll find more on the webpage and the YouTube show notes. Please like and subscribe on there and check the link to see the benefits of the full service. So let's get started. The distress alcohol causes individuals often gets lost in alcohol harm discussions, which typically focus on the pricing and marketing of alcohol. To restore the balance, I'm joined by Simon Bratt, who is a senior lecturer and program lead at Liverpool Hope University, who has over 2 decades of experience across mental health, substance use and integrated care systems. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you. To help in our bid to restore the emphasis on the individual experience, I just wanted to set aside for now the discussion of policies on alcohol as a product, which I know you fully support, and I know proponents of those policies also support much of what you're saying. So just to cut to the chase, let me instead start by asking you what kind of alcohol drinking experiences we should be talking about.
Yeah, I think interesting question, isn't it? For me, it's more around drinking that becomes harmful, want for a better word. And again, I think that's quite a contentious subject as well, really, in terms of how we define harmful. But I believe it's when we drink for a reason. If we start using alcohol for a particular reason, such as, to give an example, we did a very short kind of observational kind of research project with some nurses in A&E, and we kind of put it to them as, after a kind of a long day on shift, how do you kind of de-stress? 90% go home, have a glass of wine, or have a beer or whatever. And they were quite surprised that we were kind of saying, well, actually, does that happen all the time? They're like, yeah, pretty much every shift or every weekend or this. And to me, it's quite a harmful way to use alcohol, because you're using it for a specific reason, to cope with something that's kind of maybe socially caused or economically caused, or, within an institutional cause. So, yeah, I think for me, it's more around, it's talking about why people use alcohol. What are the reasons they use alcohol?
Okay, so people believe they're getting some utility value out of it. That's probably a mistaken belief, and may actually be sort of a behaviour that might, in the long term, backfire. Yeah,
I think so. And I think we've gone down a very strange narrative with alcohol. I think historically, it's always been, I suppose, looked at as a social comfort, want for a better word. And there's nothing wrong with that. Many years ago, I'd love to go to a pub for a drink. And interestingly, I think on reflecting on that, what it gave me is a little bit more confidence to probably engage with my friends or to engage with strangers. And it kind of, in essence, probably removed a little bit of social anxiety. But again, when you reflect on that, you're using alcohol for a specific reason, albeit if you know it or not. And I think that's where I'm coming from more than anything. I think we focus too much on the substance, i.e. alcohol, and not enough on what it actually does for us.
Right. And so ultimately we're talking about people who are using it in what might become a harmful way. People who've been drinking it maybe as a tool in their stress relief kit bag, and then 20 years later they find that they really are having significant problems as a result of this use. You emphasize, the kind of negative factors that drive us towards drinking, and they're also, at least in the first instance, some positive ones. I mean, there are also instances where this actually when it starts to become harmful. What are the indicators where sort of a misguided use of alcohol starts to become, in a material sense, harmful?
I would say, I mean, from experience, I suppose, working with a lot of people who use alcohol as a coping mechanism, I would say that word coping mechanism. I think when it becomes your go-to coping mechanism, for me, that is when it becomes particularly harmful. I think when you are looking to alcohol to calm you down, to kind of release stress, to get through the day, to help you sleep, I think that's when it becomes particularly harmful. I think there's obviously a very difference between being from an addiction point of view and a dependency point of view. Dependency being on, in one sense, the extreme of things where you become chemically dependent on that substance. So yeah, I think I think when you start to see or use alcohol for that kind of coping mechanism, I do believe it becomes quite harmful at that point.
Yeah, and I know you've talked about this, and I've also written about this, that people who are at the sort of lower end, let's say, or who are more socially deprived, tend to suffer more harm, despite actually, on average, drinking less alcohol. And you're saying, I have to say, as have I, that we shouldn't be surprised. Could you just explain why you think that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this goes to almost like a bigger political argument to some degree, is that, if we see alcohol for what it is, in my opinion, which is, it's a tool to cope, you live in inequality, poverty, alcohol becomes your go-to to cope. It becomes your go-to to cope within society. If you've experienced trauma, in whatever forms, I find it quite surprising that we are surprised that alcohol becomes that coping mechanism, and it's so readily available. It's incredibly cheap, especially in certain kind of areas of communities. It's every corner shop I know, every supermarket, etc. So it's socially kind of accepted. I work with, just to give an example, I worked with a chap recently, really, who had a recent bereavement and was asking for mental health support. But unfortunately, the waiting lists were too long to get that support. A friend mentioned to him that having a few shots of brandy at night time would help him sleep, because he was struggling to sleep, basically. So he started to do that. And over a number of weeks, he very quickly realized that it would help him sleep. But what equally he understood was that it stopped the thoughts in his mind, it stopped the voices, it stopped the kind of reoccurring memories for only a short period of time. But then, want for a better word, he wanted that peace. And the alcohol consumption became more and more and more. By the time he was accepted onto a kind of a therapeutic pathway for the bereavement, he'd become alcohol dependent. And then he was stuck in the cycle, unfortunately, where abstinence was the only way forward for him. So yeah, I suppose, to answer that question, I think we don't have a system at the moment that is able to, or has the resources to manage kind of mental health and alcoholism at the same time.
What more can be done to help people who are, facing or potentially facing these kind of circumstances?
I mean, I generally think quite a lot, really. We have, and I've wrote about this quite a lot now, but we have a fragmented system in terms of, we have substance use services, which do a phenomenal job. We have a mental health system that does a phenomenal job. I've worked with it for 20 years. I can't say it doesn't do a great job. But when we combine the two, which is incredibly prevalent, I don't think the public realize how prevalent a coexisting mental health and substance use kind of relationship is. Because we have separate teams, we almost expect mental health services often won't treat you or offer any support if you're drinking or using any sort of substance. And we then go down the abstinent model. So we're asking you to be abstinent beforehand, or we refer you to substance use services. The challenge there is that substance use services are very, very good in terms of, from a clinical perspective, and will help you to kind of almost achieve that abstinence. The difficulty is, and this, I suppose this is my argument, is that you're asking someone to stop something that's been helping them for maybe weeks, months, maybe years, actually, with very little support in between. And I always refer to it, and this, it might sound a bit sensationalized, but it's like saying to you, okay, what I'd like you to do is, you've got a respiratory problem. So what I want you to do is just hold your breath for as long as you can, and let's see how that works. I don't see a difference in a sense of, you know, I am making it a bit simplified, but you're taking away someone's coping mechanism without giving him something back. And I think that, for me, that's the problem within the system. To resolve that, I believe that we should have an integrated system. You know, substance use services and mental health services should be intertwined, and that, you know, I would bring in then housing services, etc. So you have a very generic system. Yeah, it would stop a lot of I suppose of what the person experiences, because they experience, in my opinion, it's completely dysfunctional, and they lose hope in the system.
And could you give us, I mean, I obviously not quoting specifics, but an example of what might happen to somebody who has alcohol issues and is initially referred to a substance use agency and is not given the support? Are there any sort of common patterns in
yeah, I mean, there is, and I think it's I want to be really clear in the sense of substance use services do offer support. I'm not saying they certainly don't offer support, and the people who work there are absolutely phenomenal. I think the challenge is that they don't have the right resources. So I think what you often find is you'll come to mental health services initially sometimes, and you'll be presenting with kind of distress, be that kind of anxiety, depression, etc., and you disclose that you're using alcohol. That is an immediate kind of, not a discharge at that point, but an immediate kind of referral to a substance use service. In essence, you don't get mental health support, in essence. So they want you to stop the alcohol first. So you get referred to the alcohol service, who then say, who might put you on a kind of reduction regime. You know, depending on severe the alcohol use is, they might look at detox, etc. But they never address the underlying reason that you started drinking in the first place, because they don't have the resources to do that a lot of the time. And then what happens is relapse is incredibly likely. So 70% of people that probably did go through detoxes or any sort of kind of reduction program are 70% more likely to relapse than any other kind of in any other area without that mental health support. And that's concurrent. That happens all the time. But, you know, I suppose to give you a real example, I worked with a lady recently where she was referred to substance use services, quite severe anxiety, but was drinking in excess, and very much become alcohol dependent. She to the point where she was quite unwell with it. So she was put into detox. She had a 10-day detox, which was absolutely fantastic. She left detox, I suppose, not chemically dependent anymore. We referred to mental health services. Mental health services were kind of wanting her to be abstinent for a period of time. Referred back to substance use services, who then put her on a kind of addiction regime where they worked on kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. But because they weren't directing that focus on the anxiety, it didn't work necessarily. She relapsed very quickly and was discharged, and then was discharged from mental health services. So she got discharged from substance use services and mental health services at the same time. So you get left then. You're in the, want for a better word, the grey area.
Right, and what would it look like, or does it look like in an integrated service if you were to present with a similar issue?
and this is where people say I'm idealistic, but I think it's very real, really. I think you would present, it doesn't matter, you present within a centre. If you're using heroin, alcohol, or whatever, it doesn't matter. You are then assessed at that point of entry. You are then put onto either addiction pathway, dependency, whichever. Yes, I think the substance will always be addressed first. I don't think we can ever get away from that, just because of, I suppose, how it impairs your brain cognitively at times. I think we have to address that first, but concurrently you would be given mental health support at the same time. So that might not be psychological therapy, etc., but what it would be is someone there to listen to, someone there to sit with you, someone there to go through it with you. I use the phrase kind of hold your hand. I don't mean that kind of literally, but to give you hope that this, someone's going to be with you up until the point where you no longer need alcohol to kind of cope with whatever's happening. And then that therapeutic intervention will take place. And I think that gives that person hope. It gives that person a kind of the realization that actually this will work. Where what happens currently is it's an individualistic problem. So it's your problem. If you don't attend an appointment, if you relapse, that's your fault. My service, the service I would like to see is, if you relapse, the service would ask, what did we do that caused that relapse, or what didn't we do that caused that relapse? So yeah, it would be a very integrated service where you would have substance use services, mental health, or we'd all be dual trained. So you'd be mental health and substance use trained. You'd have housing within that. You'd have safeguarding within that. So you'd have a very holistic program, basically.
Right. I mean, I was just trying to understand this sort of entanglement between alcohol dependency, let's say, and mental health problems. I mean, as I understand it from my sort of non-medical background, I mean, if you're trying to detox from alcohol, you will suffer some anxiety, mood swings, anhedonia, which to any inverted commas normal person are mental health problems of a kind. So you're already going through some sort of mental health process to deal with that withdrawal process.
Yeah, I think and that again, I think that's a common assumption, in a sense of the argument there is that the alcohol is causing that. So the alcohol intensifies what is probably underlying there in the first place. But I think from, when you're going through withdrawals, it's very different in a sense of your body is it's screaming for the substance it's been in there for such a long time. That's causing them kind of symptoms, if you like. I mean, and again, people might disagree with me, but a detox isn't particularly challenging, want for a better word. Most detoxes are pharmacologically led. So you're given diazepam, etc., to help you through that detox. My kind of issue with detox is that once you are detoxed, i.e. you're no longer chemically dependent, there's no follow-up. Often there's no follow-up care. You're discharged from whatever kind of detox unit you're in back into the community. But we don't address that reason. So when you say, anhedonia, that kind of anxiety, we don't address if that was there prior to actually drinking in the first place. And at least 70 to 80% of the time it was there. We started drinking to kind of almost cope with them symptoms in the first place, but we don't address them symptoms. And that's why we have such a high relapse rate.
Right. I mean, because I understand, I don't know, maybe my terminology is not very accurate, but
No.
The process of becoming not dependent is something which takes 3 months to a year or so before these symptoms that I talked about, the anxiety and mood swings and things like that, are likely to kind of ebb away. So it's not this is not a kind of an overnight process to be rid of these kind of gremlins you might have from having an alcohol dependent brain.
I don't disagree. I think there's a big difference between dependency and addiction. I think the dependency is that kind of I suppose you would put it on that kind of that chemical element to it, where again your brain is actually wanting that substance, needing that substance. I mean, it's probably the most dangerous part in terms of withdrawal if you're chemically dependent, because obviously people at risk of seizures, etc. It's life-threatening from that perspective. To become non-dependent is actually a very quick process, because what I suppose theoretically what we do is we allow we allow time for that substance to come out of your system in a very safe way. It's the addiction part, I think, is where we see the most challenging and the length of time. I mean, again, some people often refer to themselves as kind of in recovery for life, and then some people will go through addiction again for life. Really, it takes such a long time. But again, my argument is a lot of the time that's because we aren't giving them the right support. We're too focused on the substance, not what the substance does for the person.
Yep. No, I thought along similar lines, and also, I mean, whether we might classify ourselves as having alcohol problems, most of us have probably started drinking at a relatively young age, and done some things like go socialize, go dance, speak in public, whatever, without having a drink in your hand. And you suddenly take that away. These are all sort of fairly normal parts of life, but if you suddenly thrown into the world like a teenager with no experience in doing something, then it's going to be difficult whether you make that sort of a pathological problem or not. It's just we just don't have, we've never had any practice.
No, I think we're not educated in that sense either. I think, like you say, I feel I don't feel I'm an expert in it by any means, but I've got a really good knowledge of what alcohol does in terms of the harms it does. But if I go to a pub with my friends, I still feel quite what's the word? Not necessarily bullied into having a pint, but I feel obligated to have a drink because it's so socially acceptable. And if you don't have a drink, albeit I don't think my friends would frown upon it, there is an element, oh, aren't you drinking? And it's kind of like, well, no, I don't want to drink. But then to try and explain why you don't want to drink, it doesn't go across very well, to be honest. People, we have this stigma still, but the stigma works both ways. I think there's a stigmatization of drinking to excess and whatever we label, the labels we use for people who do that. But equally now, there seems to be a stigma that if you don't drink, it's kind of, oh, why aren't you drinking?
Well, that's I think they call it sober shaming, don't you? But but I think as you said, I think you have to acknowledge the fact that people on the other side of that equation do actually feel it. It's not they feel personally offended. Why aren't you kind of joining in? It's being standoffish. It's not. It's a real feeling. Whether you may say it's illogical. Most of our feelings are. So that's an interesting problem. The other thing is just to look at it from the other side. If you are drinking a lot of alcohol or a significant amount of alcohol, it's not uncommon to then suffer social problems, relationship problems, job problems, physical problems from injuries and stuff like that. So, I mean, which are going to have a psychological impact on us. We don't go through a sort of 6 months of personal disasters and not come out the other side smiling. So again, I'm just to go from the other side of it. You can't really be a heavy or hazardous alcohol drinker without having psychological challenges.
Yeah, I think like people. I mean, I think alcohol is the worst drug in the world. I would argue with most people that alcohol is the worst drug in the world in a sense. I think, and what you see, I think you start drinking for whatever reason you start drinking, and that continues. I think the shame, the guilt that society places on that, the moralization. We live in a very neoliberal society now where kind of we're very individual. You're expected to manage your own problems, And when you can't do that because the system won't allow it, or the system isn't able to do that, the shame and the guilt of that is so overpowering. So again, I don't think we should be surprised that people who drink, harmfully, then experience isolation, then experience kind of liver damage, because we don't cater for that population anymore. Like I say, our services aren't set up. A society isn't set up to do that, really. Again, just a few examples that the people I've met over the years, people who have probably been drinking, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, and have become recluse because they're so ashamed of actually going outside now because of the labels and the looks people give them. But equally, what I found really interesting is when you talk to the families of them people, and one of the biggest, I suppose, challenges for them families, and I'm not saying this is just the only challenge, but one of the things that stuck out for me was how much they would say their partners, their husbands, their granddads, their wives, etc., would lie. That was how much they would deceive them around their alcohol use. And I think I've always tried to frame that is that they are so shameful of the fact that alcohol is part of their life. Why wouldn't you lie? Why wouldn't you try and deceive? Because it's so frowned upon. It's so frowned upon for what's happening. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I come from a very small place in Stoke-on-Trent. We had some of the highest rated alcohol-related injuries in 2003 ever. I think we had something like 7,500 alcohol-related injuries. That's for a very tiny city. So yeah, it causes more injuries than anything else, I believe.
So yeah, we're talking about the relatively low number of people who actually seek the help you've described. I mean, it's something like 1 in 5.
Yeah.
What can be done, and what should people do to try and encourage more people to engage with the help that is available?
So I mean, obviously, I work at university now, and this might sound a bit, but I think education. I really do. I think we need to educate ourselves around. Coming into this line of work, probably in the last decade, really, and reading more and listening to people more, you do see that a lot of people out there are trying to change the way we look at alcohol, the narrative around it. I believe that's the way forward. And it's, I think it's about community. It's about it's about walking a day in their lives more than anything. And trying. I think it's very easy to say challenge the stigma, but again, the stigma exists for a reason, and I think that's because of culturally how we've always looked at alcohol. So yeah, I think education's definitely, but education in schools, start young. What I found really interesting recently was that I read a report somewhere that actually drinking is decreasing within the younger generation, but within probably my generation in the 50s now, it's actually stagnant. And so we've got more people in the 30s and 50s now, or sorry, 40s and 50s, maybe 60s, that are alcohol dependent than we've ever had. And that's almost like that lost generation. But again, for me, reaching out to them, educating their families, educating mental health workers, substance use workers, any GPs, etc. The message needs to be much wider that mental health and alcohol intertwine. And
maybe just to finish off, we have a bit of a reorganisation, let's say, in government. What could a health secretary do? Should there be a new one? Is there a policy that can be applied to this, or is it more complicated than that?
I think from a public health point of view, we recognise co-emergence. We recognise that mental health and substances, be that alcohol, predominantly, whichever, are intertwined. We don't separate them. We don't have siloed care. We look at the commissioning models and we commission joint services. I think that is the only way forward. I mean, it's quite stark. It's quite surprising that we don't do that, because I think it's 70% of people in substance use services have a mental health need. I think it's very similar. It's like probably 50% of people in mental health services have a substance use need. And I think the cost economically is astronomical. And so I am quite surprised that we have this conversation a lot. You know, since 2002, we've had all these policies. I don't think policy is going to work unless it looks at integration. But saying that, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, is that most dual diagnosis pathways that we've had since 2002 have already said that we need integrated service. It needs to be embedded in legislation now. So the Health and Social Care Act, in terms of how that separation of mental health and substance use happened, I would like to see that being changed. I'd like to see that substance use be brought back under health. I'm not saying from a kind of pharmacological perspective, but mainly due to the health risks that alcohol, very evidently have.
We normally do lots of charts and graphs and things like that, but it's very good to get into the personal experience of alcohol issues. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.